Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of many lectures about domestic violence for this course. Um, when teaching this course, one of the things I like to do is start off with a basic question that sounds kind of simplistic, but it's to examine what exactly is domestic violence. And as we're going to learn over the first handful of lectures, it's only been a handful of decades that America and many other countries have really shone a light on domestic violence and come to define it in a very broad sense. So I think it's important for us to get an idea as we start the course to look at what is it? How do we define domestic violence? And then once we give a definition to it, how do we know how prevalent it is across society in different types of cultures and different types of groups of individuals? And I think it's an important thing to take a look at that. How do we measure it? What's the data that's out there? And also under this idea of what is domestic violence, we're going to dive a little bit into the history, going back to especially focusing on America to begin with. When did we really even start to define violence against another person, whether it's a spouse, a friend, a sexual partner, whatever it may be, as being sort of a unique form of violence or aggression towards another individual? So that's what we're going to be seeing in these first couple of lectures, is sort of diving into what domestic violence is, the history around it, some of the definitions, and how it impacts different cultures. Then in a few weeks, we're going to transition into sort of what I think of as sort of the second of four major categories of the course, which is looking at who is impacted by domestic violence. And we're going to take a look at the various roles of what I call the players in any domestic violence situation. So we'll examine victims, and then we'll be followed by offenders, and then by children and the family and friends that are also connected to these various domestic violence situations. Further on in the course, we will move on to sort of area 3, which is an examination of the criminal justice system's responses to domestic violence, both historically as well as currently, across different cultures and different areas. And then we'll wrap up the semester with looking at the fourth category, which is sort of the societal responses to domestic violence. So not just like the legal system and the criminal justice system that we did in part 3, but looking how is society helping to move us forward, and what are the different policies that are coming into play that are helping us to re-examine how we look at and understand this thing called domestic violence. So to bring it all back to today, in our first lecture, we are going to start off with a few definitions that are out there about domestic violence, and then we're just going to do a very brief glimpse at the overall prevalence of domestic violence in society at this point in time. The readings that would correspond to this particular lecture are chapters 1 and 2 from your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is domestic violence? Well, as you can see on this slide, there's a lot of words. Definitely not a good example of a proper PowerPoint slide, but I think it kind of gives us the idea. And you're going to see this on the next few slides, sort of this inundation of information as we, over the last several decades, have tried to struggle and wrap our minds around defining this thing called domestic violence as a unique phenomenon and a phenomenon in society that we need to pay attention to. And we needed to try to reduce. So we start with for the United States of America, we look at if we're going to define domestic violence, where should we go? Well, let's go straight to our federal government. So the U.S. Department of Justice, and you can see a link here at the top of the slide, defines domestic violence in the following manner. And so it says, the term domestic violence includes felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence committed by, and then there's a laundry list of the potential offenders and who the potential victims could be. Now, the two takeaways as you read through this slide are, number one, you'll notice here, this is a very legal focused definition. Why do I say that? Well, because they focus on defining domestic violence as being felony or misdemeanor crimes. So it encompasses only acts that are legally prohibited. So you'll notice as we move on to the next few slides, you'll see that as we examine domestic violence, sometimes the domestic violence itself may not necessarily only include felony or misdemeanor crimes. or crimes of violence. There's types of coercion, there's psychological manipulation. And these are some of the things over the last couple decades we've really started to dig deeper into and understand, because the legal system, its hands are sort of cuffed by having to have laws in place that outlaw a particular act. So we see, even though there's a broad application of potential victims and types of offenders on this slide, it's still really focusing on things that are illegal. So these felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind. But now let's look at the various bullet points below that first statement. So felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence committed by whom? Okay, a current or former spouse or intimate partner of the victim. That kind of makes sense, right? When we think of domestic violence in its classic sense, we think of one spouse harming, hitting, hurting another spouse, right? So that one's right in there. Also committed by a person with whom the victim shares a child in common, right? So now we're allowing for divorced couples, estranged families, where all of a sudden we're broadening it. A person who is cohabitating, so now further broadening it and looking at, it may not necessarily be a spouse or somebody that somebody is married to, but it allows for simply have you lived together and sort of served as an intimate partner. Also a person similarly situated to a spouse of the victim. So now it broadens the idea of if, an ex-girlfriend or an ex-boyfriend or an ex-husband or ex-wife starts coming into play and harming somebody, it falls under this umbrella of domestic violence. And then also in that last statement down there, against an adult or youth victim. And that's where in this course, we really want to think of a broad definition of domestic violence. We want to also include things like elder abuse. If you have a couple that are living together and one of the spouse's parents move in or a parent moves in, and then you have within that domestic situation, if one of the two married individuals is inflicting harm or pain or violence upon the parent, that would also fall under domestic violence. Same with child abuse, if you have a youth victim. So the good takeaway here is in today's day and age, when we think about domestic violence, we don't want to have a very myopic, narrow view and simply think about it as being a spousal or a married or even a dating relationship in which this occurs. The sort of the tendons and the tentacles of domestic violence reach into a lot of areas of domestic life. And so that's good because it gives us a broad idea of what falls under domestic violence, but it's also difficult sometimes when we try to pinpoint what exactly is or isn't domestic violence in the realm of sort of like, legal policies and laws that are on the books. And we'll see that come to light as we go forward in this course. So let's take a look at another way of defining domestic violence. So on this slide, we break away from the U.S. Department of Justice, and even though this is still part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, just like our College of Health and Human Services that we are part of at Cal State Long Beach, the U.S. Department has a division known as the Office on Women's Health. So here you'll notice when they start to define things, they broaden this idea of domestic violence to get beyond simply what the legal code says as far as being illegal, misdemeanor, or felony acts against another person. So you can click on this link if you like to look at it. But one of the sort of the takeaways I look at it is they for the Office of Women's Health, they look at domestic violence and use a term that has become more and more popular over the last decade or so, which is known as intimate partner violence. Now, is domestic violence and intimate partner violence the same? Yes and no. So that's one of the things the takeaway. There's sort of a general umbrella of domestic violence. We saw that on the last slide, which can extend to parents and kids, and a third party that is somehow involved with the relationship. But when we look at intimate partner violence, typically we are focusing on violence or behaviors that occur within what we refer to as intimate partners, and we'll see that defined. But let's move down to where it says it includes. Okay, the statement here says it includes physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, as well as sexual coercion and stalking. So what I like on this one is this is starting to realize it's not just legal things. that are defined by a penal code or by some law as being a felony or misdemeanor act of violence. So yes, it has physical and sexual, which would probably fall under violent activities, but also emotional abuse, coercion, stalking, things that sort of fall into that gray area when we're trying to define, is somebody a victim of domestic violence or a victim of intimate partner violence? And as we move forward in this course, we're going to see that oftentimes somebody may be in a situation where they're never physically hit, they are never sexually assaulted, but I think we'll start to see that we would argue that they are living in the reality of being a victim of domestic violence, because it can be, their life can be controlled through coercion, through emotional abuse, through psychological manipulation, and sometimes that can be just as damaging as actual violence upon that person. And then also, when they talk about who is an intimate partner, on this slide, they talk about a current or former intimate partner is a person with whom you've had a close personal or sexual relationship. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So, since our last slide sort of brought up the notion of intimate partner violence and how that has sort of become a big catchphrase in the realm of this type of research and in the general area of domestic violence in general, let's take a little closer look at intimate partner violence and what it is. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2015 realized that there were way too many definitions of domestic violence out there, way too many definitions of intimate partner violence, and having a research mindset, one of the things that the CDC wanted to do was wanted to create sort of a manual or some standardized definitions of what exactly is intimate partner violence. Why is this important? Well, if you're doing research on something, and you may recall from your research methods classes, we start off thinking in very abstract ideas in research. And we have research questions that usually include constructs. And constructs, you may recall, are sort of abstract concepts that are sort of defined for research. So the term intimate partner violence is still abstract until I can operationalize it, until I can give some sort of concrete definitions and ways to specifically measure indicators of intimate partner violence, right? So if you sit down in an interview with somebody, they may say, yeah, I was in a bad relationship for a few years and I was the victim of intimate partner violence. And you sitting there listening to that person may go, okay, I have a general idea that they were in not a good place. This was not a good relationship. And I'm assuming when they mention I was a victim of intimate partner violence, my mind goes multiple places. It may go to, they may have been hit. They may have been sort of degraded and psychologically abused. They may have been watched and had their life sort of controlled through coercion. They may have been the victim of sexual assaults, things of that nature. But with that statement, intimate partner violence, as I just said with that example, I'm all over the map. I don't know exactly what specific types of violence or behaviors this person was a victim of. So that's what the CDC was trying to do in 2015. And they wanted to come up with some standardized definitions to really capture what exactly is intimate partner violence, or in other words, be able to operationalize it. And one of the things that their goal was, as you can see here, was to promote consistency in the use of terminology and data collection, which as researchers is what we want. It gives us more accurate, valid, and reliable information. So let's take a look at a brief look at the lengthy types of definitions that they have for intimate partner violence. So once again, we're looking at a very wordy slide, and you can always check the link on the previous slide to get an idea. I think these are some great resources if you're trying to get a better understanding about a lot of the topics we're going to be covering in this class anyways. But when they look at sort of intimate partner violence, the CDC starts with defining intimate partner violence, which includes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression. So they're going very broad, right? They're not limiting their focus of the types of behaviors that would fall under this umbrella of intimate partner violence by a current or former intimate partner. Okay, so here is because they've brought up another construct, now we have to define an intimate partner. And an intimate partner is a person with whom one has a close personal relationship that may be characterized by the partner's emotional connectedness, regular contact, ongoing physical contact and sexual behavior, identity as a couple, and familiarity and knowledge about each other's lives. But they have a caveat, which is often the tough part whenever trying to define things. That last sentence under intimate partner says, the relationship need not involve all of these dimensions. So when we're trying to figure out if somebody is a victim of violence from an intimate partner and we need to define intimate partner, the question when we look at this is, well, if the relationship need not involve all of these dimensions, well, how many does it have to have? 1, 2, 3, 4. And so these are some of the things that are still trying to be worked out as we continue to learn more about this field and focus more research into this area of study. And then down here towards the bottom part of this slide, we talk about intimate partner relationships. So now we're not just talking about intimate partner, but what is an intimate partner relationship? Include current or former spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, dating partners, or ongoing sexual partners. And then down here we go into see the idea that it can be cohabitating or not, opposite or same sex. The takeaway from all this is even though the CDC is trying to give us a standardized definition of intimate partner violence and all the pieces of it, you can still see there's quite a bit of complexity. So if somebody ever says, how do you define intimate partner violence? Good luck. You've got to try to find a way to boil it down and summarize it, but always with that mindset that we're still learning and the definitions may change as we get a better knowledge of this particular field of study. Okay, so those previous slides may or may not have completely answered our question of what is domestic violence, what is intimate partner violence, but I think we see some pretty key repeating themes that came out of there, right? We saw that we need to focus, any definition should focus on a broad variety of acts. So it's not just violence, either physical or sexual. It can involve coercion, psychological harm, all sorts of things. So it's broad in the sense of the type of harms that can befall the victim. And also another thing we have to think about whenever we define it is we have to be open to how we define sort of domestic or intimate partner or intimate partner relationship, and understand that there are quite a few different varieties of relationships that would sort of fall under that larger umbrella. Okay, so once we start to get an idea of how we're thinking about defining these concepts, let's look at least in the United States in the first couple decades of the 21st century, just how prevalent is domestic violence? Well, as with any sort of research, one of the most important thing about measuring prevalence is we have to think about, well, how do we measure it, right? Coming from a research methods and statistics background, one of the things I always scrutinize, and I encourage you to scrutinize, is whenever you hear a report that's giving percentages or numbers or the likelihood of being a victim or things of that nature, think about, well, what was the source of data? Because the source of data can automatically introduce certain types of biases or can sometimes reflect a different segment of the population. And so this is why oftentimes the best answer is use multiple sources of data. So on this slide, we ask the question, how should we measure domestic violence? Historically, especially since the 1970s, and in our next lecture, we'll talk about why the early 1970s is such an important time in sort of the birth, or what we're going to refer to as the revolution of understanding and starting to analyze domestic violence. So since the 1970s up until now, we think about how have we measured domestic violence. So historically, we've used police reports. We've used hospital and medical records. And only over the last few decades have we really started to focus on using national surveys to measure domestic violence. Now, with each of these sort of sources of data, we have to think about, well, what's the good and bad of each one? Who are they targeting? What are they missing? And that's kind of one of the things we have to scrutinize. So when we look back and think about police reports, well, whenever you hear something that's coming through and talking about domestic violence based upon police reports, remember, number one, there had to be a police report. So that involves multiple things. It involves a victim or a third party reporting the incident, right? So it can't be something that is overlooked or kept behind closed doors. There has to be a report of the incident. Two, the police actually have to show up and identify this particular event as being intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And then three, the law enforcement officers have to also believe that it's worthy of making a report. And so you can imagine, all from right there, we may miss out on a lot of hidden domestic violence. We'll be talking later in this semester about just the prevalence of domestic violence that takes place behind closed doors. It may go on for years, months, decades, or more, and is never reported outside of the home. So police reports, we have to think about their limitations. Similar thing with hospital and medical records, right? First of all, the victim has to seek treatment. And when they seek treatment, there has to be a disclosure of the source of the injury. And then from the hospital's point of view, it has to be identified as being categorized as domestic or intimate partner violence. And so police reports and hospital medical records, you can imagine, although they can give us some really good information about certain types of behavior, especially when that domestic violence gets serious enough to lead to the need for calling the police, or serious enough where somebody needs to seek emergency medical attention. So severe cases of domestic violence are likely to show up there. However, a lot of the more sort of what I would call, although we should never consider any form of domestic violence to be minor, but if we had to sort of rank various incidents or various situations of domestic violence, there's some that may not rise to the need of going to the hospital or calling the police, at least from the victim's point of view. So that's where the national surveys over the last couple decades have really helped us. And there's three of them that we'll see on the next slide that have really sort of laid the groundwork for us to get a better idea of just how widespread domestic violence is in this country. So let's take a look at. So currently there's more than these three, but these three surveys that are listed here in red, purple, and yellow are currently three of the most relied upon sources for data collection about domestic violence. So that's the National Crime Victimization Survey, the National Violence Against Women Survey, and then the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Now, the nice thing about all three of these is they're done on a regular basis. So every few years, the survey is rolled out again. And so it's sort of a longitudinal data collection approach. Sometimes there's components of a panel, meaning they'll follow the same people over time. But more often than not, it's what we would call a trend survey, where there's a new sample collected with each wave or round of data collection. Also for these three different surveys is they do their best to target a generally representative segment of the U.S. population. And they ask questions about, things related to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, with a very broad brushstrokes. And the nice thing about focusing on these is people who may have never wanted to report their domestic violence victimization to the police or to law enforcement in general, or to medical professionals. It's possible we can capture them because they may report things given sort of the confidentiality and anonymity of these particular surveys. Another important thing about these surveys, and this is something I want you to take a moment and think about this. So yes, we're going to capture people who we would have missed through police reports and medical reports. That seems pretty obvious, right? We can get a good look at the American population, get a representative sample, and get those people. But here's the kicker. The other thing that these victimization surveys do is they ask very straightforward questions. Things like, in the past 6 months, how often have you and your spouse, partner, boyfriend, whatever, they'll have different questions, argued? Have your arguments ever ended up in your spouse, partner, whatever, demeaning you or saying derogatory comments? And the last questions that start from that: does your spouse, partner, whatever, know where you're at all the time? Do you ever notice that they check your phone, that they have a way of sort of monitoring using GPS where your phone is at? Do you feel that they keep you away from certain friends? Things of this nature. And hopefully you're getting an idea of what I'm starting to ask with these examples. We're not just asking about overt forms of sexual or physical violence. No, we're asking for some of the more coercive and psychological tactics that are also part of domestic violence. And so the cool thing about these surveys is this: they're asking very straightforward questions that the respondent, they may not even know or think of themselves as being a victim of domestic violence. But when the researchers get the findings back and look at how people responded to various questions, they, as the researchers, can go, aha, case number 48321, given their responses to these questions, appears to be the victim of domestic violence, whether or not that particular case number or person ever even realized it. And this is one of the cool things that we need to think about as researchers and sort of consumers of this information. And it's what helps us, right? Information, education, and the more people start to see and are made aware of what exactly the indicators or factors associated with domestic violence are, we can get a better idea of controlling it, knowing the actual rates, and also for the people who may be victims, it opens their eyes to the life that they may just think that they're in a crappy relationship and they're sad all the time and they can't understand why their person that they're with is sometimes a little bit aggressive, likes to fall. They may think it's normal and sadly not even realize the situation they're in. Okay, so now let's break away from sort of the sources of how we learn about domestic violence, and let's just go through these next few slides, kind of just, like I said, we're just very broad brush strokes. We're going to go into more detail as we get further into the semester, thinking about examination of actual rates and numbers and things of that nature. But here's some things that sort of popped up that seem to be sort of like, like the front page news when it comes to domestic violence. So first off, one of the things we've realized since the 1970s is good news. Overall, it appears that as we've been learning how to measure domestic violence and done a better job with it, we have found that domestic and intimate partner violence have generally declined during the last few decades. Now, a lot of this is probably because of awareness. Like I said, the more that we become aware of the unique phenomenon that is domestic and intimate partner violence, the better we can educate the public. And the better we can provide resources to individuals, the better that law enforcement agencies and politicians can start to get an idea of, like, do we need to be creating certain segments of laws that target this? So all of these things have brought an awareness, which is a good thing. And as you can see here before from the National Crime Victimization Survey, between 1994 and 2012, measures of intimate partner violence decreased 67%, and violence between family members decreased 63%, right? Wonderful things. And that means that most likely our awareness, our intervention strategies, and our national policy, have likely played a significant role in this. But that doesn't mean domestic violence is gone. And as you're going to see on the next few slides, it is still surprising and sad to see just how many people have to experience this, even if it's just once in their life. So let's look at lifetime prevalence of domestic violence. All right, and this is, once again, you'll notice when I define things, I try to be as clear, straight from the source, because it's important that we sort of make sure how exactly do they measure these things. So looking under lifetime, we see here that victims of contact sexual violence, which is defined down at the bottom of this slide. So victims of contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner with negative impacts, that's a key thing, such as injury, fear, concern for safety, or needing services. Okay, so a very lengthy definition of lifetime prevalence of domestic violence. But you'll notice we got to make sure of the types of how it's being defined. So this is a number that you're probably somewhat familiar with, and this is, multiple studies tend to report this, that roughly 25% of women, unfortunately, will be victims of contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking and here's the key thing, with negative impacts during their lifetime. That's not good. For men, the number is lower, but it's still over 10%, right? 1 in 9 men, or roughly 11%, will be the victim of this form, this definition of violence at some point in their life. But when we go and we just think about just contact sexual violence, and not talking about whether or not they really had, significant long-term negative impacts, but simply being the victim of contact sexual violence. And if you look at that definition of it down with the asterisk at the bottom of the slide, it's not exactly enjoyable stuff. And I mean that with a big grain of salt, because if you read that definition, this is something that nobody should ever have to feel that they are a victim of. And when we look at that, it is surprising the percentage of people who will experience contact sexual violence at some point in their life. So roughly 1 in 2 women, so not quite 50%, but almost 44% of women will be a victim of contact sexual violence at some point in time. And almost 25% of men will be a victim of contact sexual violence. So even though we're working and we're reducing the rates of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, you can still see that our lifetime likelihood of somebody experiencing one of these forms of violence is still rather high. Then when we go not just lifetime, but we look at one specific sort of category of domestic violence, which is sexual violence, we can see that the numbers are still, as of just a few years ago, are still rather high. Approximately 1 in 5 women, 20% of women will have experienced a completed or attempted rape during their lifetime. Staggeringly high and a very sad reality. And then when we look at men being forced to penetrate someone, completed or attempted in a forceful manner, about 7% of men. So clearly, one of the things that we were going to stress in this class is that domestic violence isn't a guy as the perpetrator problem and a woman as the victim problem, right? One of the things we will stress throughout this is that domestic violence cuts across gender, cuts across sexuality, cuts across culture, race, religion, everything. And even though people of all types have the likelihood of being a victim of domestic violence, one of the things we've seen on these last 2 slides is, sadly, women are still at much higher odds of experiencing sexual violence than men. And there's actually another downside to that we'll talk about in a few weeks. Because there's a sense that men really oftentimes aren't victims like women are, you'll see that the resources for men is sorely lacking. And we'll have a lecture that goes into more detail about that in a few weeks. Finally, when we talk about the prevalence of domestic violence, let's just talk briefly about the victim-offender relationship. So this figure that you see here comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the National Crime Victimization Survey, and it summarizes the decade of 2003 through 2012. And it gives you a breakdown of the victim's sex and their relationship with the perpetrator. Now, you can see when we look at intimate partner, women, being the gray line, their likelihood of being victimized by a spouse, an ex-spouse, or a boyfriend or girlfriend is higher than that for men. But which is something that we kind of talked about before, but I think one of the surprising things from this slide is when we look at the victim-offender relationship, and especially as we continue to sort of make sure that we're cognizant of having a broad definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, this slide shows me something very interesting. And so take a look at it and see the male-female breakdown and see if you capture the same thing. All right, so I gave you just a couple seconds there of silence. What did I ask? I see something unique about the male-female situation that sort of pops up in this slide in a very important way. When we look at the 3 sort of main bars on the left-hand side, the intimate partner situations, women are always more likely to be victimized than men when it's that intimate partner situation. However, when we look over to the right-hand side in the 4 major categories there of the immediate family, we see something different. We see that men are more likely to be victims of domestic violence when the perpetrator is a parent, a sibling, or some other relative. And this is one of the things, and then it's roughly equal when the perpetrator is a child. Um, and this is one of those things where we really want to make sure of when we think about domestic violence. We don't want to be, as I started this lecture off with, is being too myopic and only assuming that it's women who are the victims, or only assuming that it only occurs within some sort of, cohabitating spousal or sexual relationship. Domestic violence and our need to understand it and our need to have protections for victims goes very broad. And when we look at the fact that the left-hand side, where we understand that women are more likely to be victims, we've been focusing on that for a while. But when we look on that right-hand side and start to see where men are more likely to be victimized, that raises a question of why we need to pay so much closer attention to what's going on in family situations, and especially when things can be kept behind closed doors, which is going to be a problem that has pervaded our understanding of domestic violence for decades, and continues to do so. So we're going to stop right there for this slide. Our next lecture will be posted soon, and we're going to start taking a closer look at a little bit of a historical understanding, as well as looking at the prevalence of domestic violence across different cultural groups. So have a good day.